All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. We're letting people sort of get settled, come in, connect to audio. We're so excited that you are here for our summer blitz session that we're super excited about compassionate and equitable grading. So definitely get set. I will tell you, you might want to open like a Google Doc or have something to write with near you, because in a moment we'll be doing some reflecting and writing, and we'll have a couple of opportunities throughout also to do that work. All right. If you haven't yet, now is a great time to sign in. We were kind of spamming it in the waiting room, but you can use the QR code and we will get the link also back in the chat for those of you that are just entering our space today. This is how you will get your sketch credit. So definitely make sure that you sign in and use the form that is either through the QR code or on the chat. No problem. Yeah, we are here to be sure that you get the credit that you need. So all that is good. As you're signing in and you're thinking about getting your pick number and all that good stuff that you need to do, we're also going to ask you just to introduce yourself in the chat. So if you wouldn't mind telling us your name, where you teach, what grade level you teach, and if you're using any compassionate or equitable grading strategies already. Doesn't matter how big or small you think they are. We want to hear about them. So if you've got that, we're ready for you. It's good to see some elementary folks here. I know sometimes the question comes up, what does grading have to do with me? Lots. It has lots to do. Including setting up mindsets for later. So that's great. Good to see folks. Wyandotte well represented today. Hello, Trenton, Southgate. Love to see our downriver friends here. That's awesome. That's great. Cool. Again, if you're using any alternative grading practices right now, big or small, just let us know too. Cool. That's great. Hi, Darcy.
Good.
From Grosse
Yeah.
Pointe. Heather and I were over on the east side earlier, so hello from hello to east sider. We passed you. That's great. All right. Feel free to keep introducing yourself using the chat. Awesome. Literacy interventionist D7. That's awesome.
Nice.
Cool. Feel free to keep introducing yourselves. We'll roll with it here. My name's Jeff Austin. I use he, him pronouns. And I'm a literacy consultant here at RISA. I've been on my ungrading or grading less journey, however you want to phrase it, for a little more than a decade. And so this work is really near and dear to my heart. I think one of the things that probably saved my teaching career in a lot of ways was leaning into alternative and equitable and compassionate grading practices, largely because it helped my relationships with students. I didn't want to be an adversary to my students, but I feel like grading puts us at odds. It puts us on the opposite sides of the table, and I just couldn't do that anymore and be the teacher that I wanted to be. So I had to figure something out, and so we'll hear bits and pieces of my little origin story here today, but that's definitely part of it for me. And I just thank you for having the courage and compassion to be here and talk about this topic, which is just I think something that's very hard to talk about for reasons we'll talk about today. But grading is so interwoven into our system. Rethinking it is really, really hard, particularly because we all have a grading experience also. Heather?
Hi, everyone. Heather Rottermond, assessment and instruction consultant. I've also been on a grading journey. I left the classroom quite a while ago. But while I was in the classroom, I was starting to play with different ways and structures of grading, and different ways to give feedback to students. So you'll hear a little bit of that, even though I've been away from it for a little bit. You'll hear how Jeff and I continue to support educators in Wayne County around grading practices.
As always, we like to begin our sessions with a land acknowledgement. Really connecting to the land is very important to us. There are so many stories in our region, and we always, in any space that we're in, try to make sure that we uplift that and point that out. Our land acknowledgement today is brought to you by Healing by Choice, which is a woman and gender nonconforming organization that operates here locally. We begin by honoring the ancestral land on which we live, the indigenous land of the Anishinaabe people of the Three Fires, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. Detroit is the largest majority Black city in the nation, with a long legacy of African diasporic global contributions, which was once one of the last stops on the Underground Railroad, known by its codename Midnight. Detroit is also the US city with the largest concentration of Arab Americans, a border city with historic and growing Latino, Latina, Latinx communities, and a legacy of Asian American communities and movements. We acknowledge this land, its history, all the being seen and unseen, known and unknown as we step in to work on this land, most of us as uninvited guests. We offer this work in the spirit of reparation, devoting ourselves to justice as we strive to uplift the legacy of this land.
So for our session today, we have an ambitious session um, and an ambitious agenda, but for our session, we're going to engage in a quick connector, which will kind of ground us for some of the discussions and things we have later on in the session. So we'll talk about our personal grading stories. We'll also talk about why we're here and what are some of the issues that educators are running up against with traditional grading practices and systems. We'll explore different options for grading, and we'll talk a little bit about everyday advocacy and some of the things that you can do to move toward a more compassionate and equitable grading practices, but also how you can advocate for it. And then we'll adjourn with our next steps.
Yes, that is ambitious. I'm glad you pointed that out. It is that truer words were never spoken. Before we dive into our stories, I think we do need to point this out, right? And that is, as we were talking about earlier, grading is so interwoven into what we think school is. Judgment is woven into what we think school is. That it can be very, very hard to separate grading from the school experience. And as you heard in the agenda, you might say, but I have to give grades. And that may be true, but we'll talk about ways that, again, we can move toward doing that in more equitable and compassionate ways. The mandates of learning are such, especially right now, in our culture, that learning is very linear. It happens at the same rate, at the same time for everyone. But we know that's not true. There are wide variations in human development and human achievement. And so we're kind of working with those and through those. It's okay that it's messy. And grading, I think, to the extent that we use it, really should probably honor the fact that learning is really messy. It's really nonlinear. Achievement varies. And that people are kind of and can be on different timelines. Similarly, I think too, our journey toward grading less or becoming gradeless needs to also kind of keep this in mind and reflect this also, right? It's Heather and I have tried 100 different ways to give feedback, 100 different ways to improve our grading practices, 100 different ways to grade less. It's about finding out what works for you in your context with your students in your school. And it's good to see a lot of people from the same district here, because it also requires working really across systems, which we'll talk about later also. But if things make you uncomfortable today or push on an edge that you have about grading, that's great. That's why we're here. We grow in those spaces. So if you do feel discomfort today, know that that's really natural in these kinds of conversations. Heather, you want to kick us off with our connector and get people into our stories?
Yes, yes. This is a quote from Sean Michael Morris, and it comes from when we talk about grades, we're talking about people. So I'll read the quote, and as I'm reading, think about your own grading or assessment experience that really stands out to you. But it'll make more sense once I read the quote to you. Grades hamstring us by their very nature. Grades get soaked into the learning identity of the student who gets them, whether they get straight A's or they're a solid B student or they receive the occasional F. After college and amongst friends, we might even bond over the kinds of grades we got. The geniuses who nearly failed out, the up by the bootstraps first generation student who had to work while at school but earned their 4.0, the happy slackers who contented themselves with C's. We continue to talk about grades long after they've ceased to matter because they mark us indelibly. We continue to talk about grades long after they cease to have matter because they mark us indelibly. And it's just as important to recognize that indelible mark as it is to recognize that if grades can cease to matter at some point in our lives, it might stand to reason that they never really mattered in the first place. So I want you to take a moment to think and reflect on a grading or an assessment experience that marked you indelibly. What did it happen? How did it matter? And why might it continue to matter? And then after a few moments of reflection, we'll have an opportunity to share our experiences. Okay. Hopefully you were able to think about an experience. Sometimes this comes rather quickly. Sometimes we have to really think about it. And we're going to put you into breakout rooms for a few minutes and allow you to share in smaller groups about your experience that marked you indelibly. Um, Feel free to share if you're open to sharing. You don't have to, knowing that grading can in these experiences can be deeply personal. So I'm going to put you into breakout rooms.
Welcome back. We're just waiting on the last few breakout rooms to close. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Hope we know that was not probably enough time to share and dig in. Like Heather said, we've got an ambitious agenda. But hopefully this also gets you thinking a little bit about your origin stories. One of the people that we really respect and admire in the ungrading world is David Buck. And we asked him, what you what was your origin story? What brought you to this, right? And so and he was like, wow, no, I don't think I've ever really wrestled with that or grappled with that. But we all come to sessions like this for a reason, and unpacking that reason, even if Heather said it sometimes hurts or it feels like there's some trauma involved, can be really helpful in moving forward and understand why we're doing what we're doing or why we're trying to rethink the things that we're trying to rethink. So thank you for sharing. We will not make you share in the public space. We know that these stories are very, very vulnerable. And speaking of David Buck and another of our favorites, Asao Inoue, um, we've used this term compassionate a lot already. And you might be wondering, like, what does it mean to move toward compassion? What does that look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? And David Buck and Asao Inoue both use in their classrooms what they call the Charter for Compassion. And this is a glimpse into what's kind of in that charter, and how they structure and orient their classrooms toward compassion. And I really think that these things are beautiful. And I think they can work with learners of any age, including adult learners, to really think about how we act compassionately. Um, and this is open material, so if you see something you really like here, feel free to take it, feel free to use it. But we give credit to Asao and David for great work here, and how they structure their courses. So these are again some tangible ways that we get to a more compassionate education system and more compassionate classrooms. All right. Hopefully, what this is a picture of. If not, it will become clear in a second. But this is a grub. And I think one of the things that pushes us away from compassion is sometimes the language we use around students, or the language that might be used in our spaces and our school systems around students and about students. And this is a grub. And as you can see, no offense to grubs, but they are unpleasant creatures. That is not a nice looking thing. And so one of the terms that I think we frequently use to describe students who may be interested in grades or might be fueled by grades is we sometimes call them grade grubbers. Now, I don't think any of us on this call think about our students like this creature that we see here, but we use the term. So language can orient us to deficit. And so we use that term grade grubber. But I think moving away from terms like this as an example is really important. Students are not at fault necessarily for chasing points or grubbing for grades. This is the way that they've been systematized to be in school. And so if we don't like the way that they're being socialized into school, it's our responsibility at individual and collective levels to make the change that's needed to live into something different. So systemic failures do not belong on our students' shoulders, but we often put them there through the language we use. So grade grubber, point chaser, all of these things have really negative connotations, but they also are primarily out of students' control. This is how they've been socialized. This is how they've been brought in. So if we say, don't chase points or don't grub for grades, but we've set systems up that encourage them to do exactly that. And not any individual in here or any individual in the teaching profession is totally at fault for this. But if we have systems that move in that direction, then we have to change those systems. And part of changing systems means changing language and how we describe kids. So this is one way immediately. Tomorrow, you could be more compassionate. Is just watching the language you use. Because even if you're intentional, some of this stuff can seep in. And we want to make sure that we're avoiding that to the extent that we can. All right, we're gonna play a little game. Are you ready? Heather, you ready to play our little game? So
I'm ready.
get your chat window up. So we're gonna ask you some questions, and we want to know what's the issue with whatever we show you on the screen. So we're going to show you some common grading practices, and we want you to think about what might be the issue with these grading
Oh, you can leave it on.
So we're going to think about that. Here we go. Here's number one. So get your chat into the space where you can type. We're going to kind of go rapid fire here. What's the issue with maybe averaging student scores across a term or a semester? Or even a whole marking period. Think about that. You can feel free to use the chat.
Yes, Rob.
Rob, that's awesome. Yes. They prioritize. We got it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So it burdens them to the past.
Yes.
And we want to reward growth, right? We want to reward improvement. But this tethers them to before, right? Anything else, Heather?
I love that it penalizes students for beginning learning experiences. Like that
Yes.
is that's a great point. It certainly does that. Does
All right.
not highlight best achievements, equity with the assignments. That's another
That's
thing
another
that
one.
is,
Areas of strength. Okay. We're cooking, folks. All right. Here's the next one. Oops. Now here's the next one. Curving student scores and summative assessments. This feels good. This is like a little sugar high. But what might be the problems?
it takes me back to college,
Yes.
undergrad.
Takes me back to high school science, maybe even where curving would be like let's say the top score is a 70% and I make the 70% a 100%. Right. So I say, okay, I'm going to curve everybody by 30. Tina,
Yes.
you're in. What are grades supposed to do? Communicate, right? Communicate understanding of content, communicate the skill and the actual ability that you have. This gets messy, right? When we start curving scores. Because
Yes,
now
Jeff.
it looks like, yeah, there you go. Falsely shows kind, right?
Yes.
See, we don't want to do that, right? Because we are going to say that grades matter, then they have to communicate something of value. So if I really got to, if I really only understand 70% of the content, but you're giving me 100, that gives me a inflated view. It might give my caregiver an inflated view too about what I know and what I can do. All right, here we go. There's two more. This is a hot one. Using zeros on a 100-point scale. What's the problem? Yes, and thanks, Charisse. That's bullseye, nail in the head. Zeros on a 100-point scale. What's the issue?
Ooh, I battled this one when I was still
Oh,
teaching.
me too. Me too. You can check the scars, right? Bigger range for failure. That's right. Tina hates zeros. Yes. If I get a zero, what does it matter if I do this or not? Yeah, greater range for failure, Rob. Totally. Yes. Great, great.
Puts them in the mathematical hole that they can never climb out of.
You can never get out of it.
Never.
We just talked about averaging student scores, but if you're averaging zeros in there, holy cow, right? How do I ever recover? Even if I want to.
Even if I want to.
And Heather knows this about me. Yes, zero. They often shut down. Yes, that's totally true. Hope is important. I have to be able to believe that I can. Aside from it being mathematically indefensible, it's hard to hope if I'm getting weighed down by all these zeros. And Heather knows this about me, but another part of my origin story is I was a little bit of a knucklehead in school. And so I got lots of zeros, right, over the course of time. Eventually, you just don't care anymore, right? Like, what's another zero out of the many that I've received? And so if I don't have hope, and it's not good feedback. Yes, zeros when averaged, it's a big problem, right? Putting that average in there. Okay, last one. This is another hot one. We're going right for it today, including attendance and tardy data in student grades. What's our issue? Christine, we'll shout you out on that too. We'll talk about that a little later. We'll be sure we get into that for sure. And you can feel free to always bring up opposing viewpoints, right? It's not super clean and clear all the time.
Ah, yes, Danielle.
Yeah, Danielle, kids don't get themselves there, so sometimes that's really hard, right? Like I'm not responsible. Yes, Rob with the tongue in cheek there about the Kleenex boxes and the pencils and the Clorox wipes for a bunch of points. Yeah, right. It makes things messy, right? It's kind of the theme. Um, again, if we're interested in communicating something accurate, that's really tough. It's really tough to do if you're including that. We'll talk about another issue too in just a second, but
And that last one could land you in some hot water, like legal troubles.
yes, yes.
Because of, kids are required to be at school, but yes, they're there. And there's been court cases where grades have had to be changed because of the inclusion of attendance and tardy.
Um, and to your points in the chat and to Heather's points, maybe the similarities that exist here are all of these render grades pretty inaccurate, right? They tamper with the accuracy. So if we're if you came here and you said, I think traditional grading is really great, and I think we should kind of stick with the system. Okay, but I think it's also relevant that we need to deal with these things also because they are rendering the grade to be less accurate than we would want it to be because it's infused with a whole bunch of noise. We want mostly signal. I don't know that it'll ever be 100% signal, but we want mostly signal, and we want to limit the noise, right? I think that's what we're trying to get at. All right, and we've talked about all of these things already, but there are a bunch of issues with traditional grading, and you've put them out there in the chat already. And when we're talking about traditional grading, Heather and I, we're kind of thinking about the A to F or A to E 0 to 100 scale. That's kind of what we. But we've talked about how averaging scores can't account for growth, or at least makes it hard to account for growth. We talked about how curving assessments kind of disrupts what students know and are able to do, and it transmits maybe a false narrative about student achievement to the students themselves, but also to the people that are at home. We'll talk about deservedness in a second, but traditional grading that includes behavior and tardy data and attendance data, that gets into, I think, some tricky situations, certainly legally, as Heather just brought up, but also maybe morally and ethically. And then you hit the nail on the head, chat. Zeros on a 100-point scale does create mathematical inequity and also potentially a sense of hopelessness. I can never dig out of it, particularly if that score is being averaged over and over and over again. So thanks. We were right on it. Okay, I want to talk about this concept of deservedness for just a second. Because brought it up back here, right? That in this third box that it fosters deservedness and invites bias. So I just want you to think really quickly. What do we want grading to do or not do in our classes? What do we want grading to do or not do in our classes? Give you like 30 seconds to think about that. You jot it down, you can put it in the chat. And thanks for that too, but I was here and I should have an A argument. Talk about that in a second too. So what do you want grading to do or not do in your classes? Right. This is a good question from Jesse Stommel. We'll have a link to some of his stuff really at the end, and that you can check out.
Yeah, Christine, what they are learning and mastering, showing accuracy,
Measuring growth.
measuring
Beautiful.
growth.
That's
Yes.
what we want. Awesome. You can keep those coming too. Couple of quotes here. Heather, do you want to give us the Cornelius Minor quote, and I'll do the Joe Feldman quote?
That's perfect.
Beautiful.
I love Cornelius Minor. If you've not ever read any of his work, he's absolutely brilliant. You can, and his books are really easy to read, and he provides really practical strategies for teachers in the classroom. He also plays devil advocate in a lot of his work. Like he'll say like what's kind of like, the narrative that's currently happening and like what you could do differently. So his work is absolutely amazing. So even though grading is about proficiency, it often gets conflated with behavior. You can have a student who is proficient at calculus, but if the teacher doesn't like the fact that they are consistently late to class, that kid gets marked down. Again, there's an unspoken pact teachers have with their children. I will agree to teach you well if you demonstrate to me that you deserve it.
And Joe Feldman says this about zeros and compliance and deservedness. A humbling but reluctantly honest reason many of us continue to use the zero on a 100-point scale may be because the zero satisfies a psychological need. Well, Reeves, he's referring to a different author, sardonically recognizes teachers' need to punish the little miscreants who fail to complete our assignments. This need among us to feel satisfaction, to hold our students accountable for not following our directions is very real and powerful. So when we think about this, um, you know, when we think about moving away from traditional grades and into something that's more equitable and compassionate, we're thinking about moving away from power. We're thinking about moving away from control, from command and compliance, but also, and I think this is where the deservedness part comes in, how good we are. Somewhere along the line, good grades got associated with being a good person. And there's like this moral attribute to it. And that is also really I think a little bit problematic and something to wrestle with, right? Just because you've gotten really high grades and high scores does not necessarily mean that you are a good person or that you um, are morally superior. Just as if you get low grades, you're not morally inferior either, right? You're not a bad person or a bad student per se, right? So separating out the achievement from the moral or the achievement from the personal seems really important also. Because they get tied together a lot, and that has real impacts on how students see themselves, how they see each other, and their self-efficacy really. And so that's this is a little tricky, but it's like it's something I think have to work ourselves away from, right?
Yes, yes, yes. Look at the software that we're required to use.
Oh,
Jeff and
well,
I talk about
oh,
hacking the grade book all the time. How do we make it work?
yes, amen. I mean, this is a selling point of LMS software, right? Is that
Yep.
it connects with the grade book easily, but there are flaws and problems with that, which is why, to Heather's point, it requires hacking. Um,
Mhm.
and you can there's all kinds of politics involved in that also, of course. But yeah, it's like if you want to do alternative grading, there's lots of effort on your part to sort of hack your system, whatever it might be, whether it's MyStar or Power School or like whatever. There's hacks you have to do. Okay. Some people might say, and you might be saying this right now to us, which is fine. I have to give grades. Like I'm obligated. I'm required. It is part of my duty. This is totally true. We know. We've been there. We've lived it, right? We know that grades are part of it. And while you might go, hey, there's output that I have to give. Yes, there has to be a grade on that report card 4 times a year. I know. Um, there's no way around that part. But the inputs, how the grade actually gets given and figured out, you actually do have some agency and control over in most cases, right? Um, and so how it gets earned, how it gets logged into the system, those are kinds of different conversations and places where you can actually hack your own practices to be a little bit more compassionate. Um, we've already talked about this a lot today, but minimum grading. This is making it so there aren't 60 gradations of failure, right? But so we're orienting ourselves around a Heather talks about this a lot, but like a 0 to 4 system or a 1 to 4 system maybe might be better if you're interested in using that kind of scale. Anything you want to say about that scale?
I would, yeah. So the
Yeah.
proficiency levels,
Yes.
often what they're called, um, but they're helpful. But part of that work comes with like shared understanding of like really what each proficiency level looks like, and what it looks like in practice too. So it's really good to, a lot of schools will put these on paper, But then when it comes time to complete the report card or put something in the grade book, they're like, I don't know. So having shared conversation, sharing of practice, sharing of student work can help refine, but also provide a shared understanding around what each of those levels can look like. I'm also, I mean, this can also be related to even the use of your rubrics, moving away from the different gradations on a rubric, because there could be many, and only looking at a single point on a rubric.
The single point rubric, speaking to my heart. There you go. I talked about my origin story a little earlier, how I came to think about grading practices differently. This was really one of my first forays into the space was delayed grading. Some people use process letters, which I think are also really amazing. But what this meant for me was before a student got a grade in the grade book, they had to do some reflection on the feedback that I gave them and either talk to me about it or fill out a form depending on how they felt or what they wanted to do. And then I would put the grade in the grade book once they've had some time to reflect. So and Heather and I have written about this, but the further you can get feedback away from a grade, and not just Heather and I, many people have written about this. The further you can get feedback away from a grade, the better, right? The further you can separate those things in somebody's mind. So if the gratifications, so to speak, is delayed a little bit, that can be beneficial. Process letters, just like having kids describe how they arrived at that final product and what they did, that can be helpful too. I never use that as much, but I did use delayed grading. Um, this is something I use a lot, and something I know some other folks in the educational community use a lot, which is self-reported grades and grade pitches. So you know, Heather, you did such a great job of describing the rubrics, the problems with rubrics, how we can make them better. That single point rubric, I think, really opens up the grade pitching conversation because you're looking at what the standard is and you're thinking about exemplars of that work potentially, and you're having a conversation with a kid about where you think that they land, right? Are you a 4, 3, a 2, or 1? Why? Let's look at these exemplars. Let's look at these levels. Let's think about what they mean together. So this like really leans into our workshopping and conferencing. Um, and it gives kids some agency and autonomy. So grading is not something that's done to them. It's something that's done in conversation in conjunction with them. You might say, but Jeff, like everybody's going to say that they want an A, right? And actually the research on grade pitching and self-reported grades is that people rate themselves lower artificially. But also if let's say somebody did do that, let's say Heather comes to me and we're conferencing and she's like, this is a 4 or an A or what, however your system is. That's when we can go back to exemplars or the levels or the standard and go, do we really think that's the case? Do we really honestly believe that? And then, you know, talk about why that is or isn't. So, you know, most people are receptive to that conversation. Heather, do you want to, you've got some good responsive reassessment policies. Do you want to give maybe an example or two?
Yeah. So in my classroom, I when students didn't do so well on the assessment, they could always retake it. I always allowed retakes. And it didn't mean that the retakes were unlimited, right? Um, and but I had some parameters around how and when that would happen. Students had to show me, you know, a little bit of the work that they've put in. And they could either conference with me, we could do some reteaching, or they could show me some of the studying that they had done around a particular concept. But they wouldn't get to take the entire test. I would only retest them on the piece or of the learning target or the standard that they missed. So it helped alleviate some anxiety with testing, knowing that they wouldn't have to retake the entire test. They just had to retake the portion of the test that they really missed. And most often, having this as, you know, a retake policy in my classroom, kids studied for the test. Like I really didn't have a ton of kids taking advantage of it, like because they didn't do the work. They knew that the work that was leading up to the assessment was truly preparing them for the assessment. So it meant that I had to be really intentional with what I gave as a task. It had to be relevant and connected, but also connected to what I was assessing on too. So That was just one way with which how I handled it. I taught middle school. Um, and I found it to be really easy. And I would do the retake in class.
Hmm.
So I structured my class so a student wasn't missing their lunch. They weren't missing, another class to retake. It was done in my classroom.
I love that one. I taught econ for a while, and I was kind of struggling with kids. The graphing can kind of throw kids off in econ. It's tough. But actually having them do it, giving them a problem, showing them just do it in front of me on the board, right? While we're sitting there, and talk me through it, like that can be a good reassessment, right? Because you're watching them think and act in real time. Um, and
What
so
were
that
the
was
other?
efficient.
That's a good, that I love that. That's very
Yeah.
responsive. So Danielle, you had a good question. What are the
Yep.
other kids doing? The other kids, I taught ELA, so and kids had like choice time. They could be working on like choice reading, choice writing. So it didn't, I tried to do as minimal interruption of like actual instructional time, but kids were able to the other kids were reading or writing during that time. So no new content was being missed because a child had to retake. That's part of, being not only responsive, but also equitable. I didn't want the child to miss any sort of content from any other teacher as well. So it just happened in my classroom and it worked for me. But I also didn't give them crazy long tests. I gave them really, like I was really deliberate with how I structured my assessments. And they were often, I mean, a lot of it could have been done through a conference, like Jeff had mentioned.
Yeah, that's another good question that Jeff's bringing up in the chat. And this is this is another hot button issue, right? So I taught in a school that had an 80 for a while, that had an 80-20 system for mastery versus what they call process, or summative informative. Um, and there were some people that really believe that if you're taking it the second time, the highest you can get was 80. And there were others who believed that if you're showing mastery, why isn't the full allotment of points available to you? Particularly going back to our earlier conversation, if we're really rewarding growth, um, then it makes sense that I should be able to get the full range of points that are available to me. Then that opens up questions like, well, if a kid gets a 99, are we retaking, and all that stuff. But I think you can have like pretty healthy parameters around that kind of thing. And that's where I think it's useful, maybe as a department or a school, to have those kinds of conversations, to say, like, what are some reasonable parameters here around reassessment? Because Heather, you didn't let kids retake endlessly, right? If we're on retake 8, right, I think that we can have a different conversation, but certainly before 8. But
Exactly. And Jeff, because they were retaking the portion that they didn't
yeah,
do
that's
well
another good
on,
point.
I just regraded the assessment. So, but I would include that as part of the original score. So kids could go up from their original score. It wasn't limited to just an 80. So if I had 4 parts, A, B, C, or D, and they had to retake part A, then I just factored in that new part A into the score.
And I think there's like lots of openness for conversation about this. But the one thing I just would say that I probably wouldn't do, or would advise against, is averaging the two scores together, right?
Yeah.
For all the reasons we've already talked about.
Yep.
All right. Another thing that you can do is you can rethink your LMS setup. And we've had that conversation already today too. And you can hack it, essentially. Maybe that's another session, Heather. We're talking about hacking these LMSs. All right. So Heather and I also wanted to talk about what this means systemically, right? These things exist on a continuum. And there are things that we have control over in our individual classrooms, but that we don't have control over systemically. So like I can do delayed grading or minimum grading in my classroom. It's better for all doing it, probably. But I can do it in my classroom, and I may have control over those inputs, but some of the bigger things, like Heather was alluding to, kind of talking about some of the issues around standards-based grading, when you get into those gradations and what does this mean? What is a 4? Right? You're having those kinds of conversations. That has to be done as a team, right? That really you it's hard to do alone, if we're being honest. So some of this again is very individualized, but systemically we can start to move toward other ways of grading. And I want to say I'm gonna do my best to channel my inner Bettina Love here, because she has a really great talk about this. But you know, um, for all of the difficulty and sadness and isolation of the pandemic, it showed us that things were possible that we never thought were possible before. And um, including a lot of schools shifting their grading systems away from that traditional AF 0-100 scale into something that looked different. And so if you're willing to play that hand in crisis, let's keep that energy in 2024, in 2025, in 2026 and beyond, because we now know that different is possible. So a lot of people went to pass fail grading, credit, no credit. Those can be options in certain spaces. Now, again, you don't want to talk about what that meant and how that looked, and you'd have to communicate with your caregivers and families. But a different world is possible, and we were shown that. So you just think about this is kind of a continuum, and this continuum is huge. Um, okay. Um, Alfie Kohn, he talks a lot about this. It is great if we are using um, alternative grading practices in our classroom. So we're using delayed grading, or we're using process letters, or conferencing, or whatever. But eventually, right, the true power in it is branching out from there. But as Heather and I alluded to, it is hard to have these conversations as a staff. Um, Generative conflict around grades and grading is hard. It's really difficult. We are not generally equipped for generative conflict as a society. So then you get into hot button issues like this, where people have passionate arguments and passionate thoughts. It can be tricky if you're not if you haven't set the stage and built the foundations and set the system. Um, but there are ways still that we can advocate for something different or something better. And Kathy Fleischer and Antero Garcia wrote a really beautiful, accessible book called Everyday Advocacy. This is about teachers changing the narrative in their schools. They lay out this plan that makes advocacy safer and more sustainable across our schools. So we move from identifying a small concern and narrowing that concern down. So you're not going to be like, probably not the best way to advocate is we're going to just totally overthrow the system. As much as maybe some of us on here would like that, that's usually not an effective way to get change done. And so, think about your building, think about your district, think about your school. What's right for change right now, right? Is it maybe minimum grading? Is it maybe thinking about feedback practices? Is it maybe a little LMS hacking? And then figure out how you can talk to different people in different groups about what that would look like in me. And so you're having a conversation with students. And I think speaking with students about a different grading future is really powerful. It's maybe one of the most powerful things we can do. But also speaking to, again, families and caregivers, our administrators, our colleagues, our school board members. It's all part of a really vast fabric of a better future, and really a more just and equitable future, and a more compassionate future for ourselves and for our kids. Anything you want to say about advocacy, Heather?
The only thing that I would add would be that grading as we have it now is like it's traditional, it's very steeped in and rooted in I mean, we've been using the same system for a long time. And because other things always surface up as being important, grading and assessment practices are often like pushed to the side. And so when you try to make change with grading or even initiate the conversation, like Jeff had mentioned, you can be met with some pushback. Often because this is how I've always done it. This is my philosophy. But it's often because it's what was done to us, right? We often replicate some of those practices that we've inherited, um, you know, along the way as learners, also through student teaching. So um, I love this idea of advocating in really small ways, and being mindful of the things that you can do with how you grade in your classroom, and being able to advocate for those practices to expand.
Um, it's it's 4 o'clock, and we need to set these people on their way. Um, However, we were going to answer some rapid fire questions about some that we hear about grading. Many of you asked these in the chat, so we were kind of on the mark with some of these questions. Um, Heather, would you be open to potentially, you know, later or maybe tomorrow at some point, maybe we jump back on and we can record a quick video talking about these that we can send out with the slides?
Yeah,
Would that be good? So that we can keep
absolutely.
people on time. But we do want to answer these questions and answer the questions that you were asking in the chat that are adjacent to these questions. We'll make sure that video that we record gets sent to you. But you can always feel free to reach out to us also in that way. Last thing we'll say before we head off, because we do want to keep you on time. We know that this is a really, really busy time of year. Um, Wherever you are in this journey, wherever you are in this process, there is an entry point for you. These are a bunch of different entry points that you might want to click on. You'll get the slide deck. These are all clickable links. You can click on some of these and figure out what works for you. But Heather, I want to leave on this point that you just made that's also up here from Schneider and Hunt. Grading remains a central feature of nearly every student's and teachers' and parents' school experience. As such, it can be easy to perceive them as both fixed and inevitable, without origin or evolution. An effect of this is that despite their limitations, grades are often accepted quite uncritically by all parties involved. If anything, this year, if you're thinking about this, just being more critical, getting your students to be more critical about grades, thinking differently about them, that's a huge step in the right direction and a huge win. Thank you for being here today and settling in. We're going to make sure you get all these materials. We appreciate you. This is a hard topic, but we're grateful for your time.
We also have I'm going to pitch our responsive
Oh,
assessment
yeah,
network.
let me go to that slide.
We have a network. We meet quarterly and we just talk about all of these things. We problem solve. We learn together, and it's virtual. So it's like I think it's 90 minutes and it's after school. So these are the dates that we plan to meet and talk about all of these things that we've talked about today, but also the things that are actually happening inside the classroom so that we can help you move toward more equitable and compassionate grading practices.
Oh, how do they join that? Can we get these people a link?
Yes, let me drop it in.
All
Let me
right.
drop it in. Let me pull it up and then let me drop it in.
Here it is. We'd love to see you at the Responsive Assessment Network.
Yes, yes, yes.
Because as Heather said, this is a place and time for us to like really dig into these issues and again talk about those really specific things that are happening in your spaces and do that problem solving. Thank you, everybody. We definitely appreciate your time and your thoughts and your brilliance. Have a great year.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. We are back. We hope you missed us as much as we missed you. We are attempting to answer some questions that we had that we were going to do during our hour together during the Blitz. We know that is not really enough time to dig into all the issues that rethinking grading presents. So we had some rapid fire questions, but in answering these, we also wanted to answer some of the things that came up in the chat. Because there were, like, I think some really good questions and some really important things that we need to wrestle with when we talk about going gradeless or grading less, or even just rethinking traditional structures. So that's kind of our goal here with this short video that we're attaching to the other Blitz video that we have. So the first question that we were going to answer, and I do think that this, Heather, also came from the chat. We heard this, right? And we really want to directly address it because it is such a good, important, valuable, resonant question. And that really is, do we think alternative grading strategies, rethought grading strategies like minimum grading, the act of on a 100-point scale, counting missing work, for instance, as a 50, create bad habits in students? Heather, what do you think? Is this all creating bad habits?
I don't think so. In my own experience and even in the literature, um, like a minimal grading or an alternate grading structure kind of takes the pressure off of having to be performative all the time for kids. And so they get to engage in the learning and focus on the learning and how they will show what they know through a really rich and relevant task. So, in my opinion, it really alleviates that pressure of having to constantly worry about a grade or fretting over missing assignments or even late work, but that we're really working towards um, understanding the learning in a deep and rich way.
I mean, this is a good way to push back against systems also. I mean, in the Blitz session, we showed the picture of the grub, and we've talked about the term
Yeah.
grade grubbing and the deficit orientations that sometimes grading compels us to put around students. And I think that these alternative structures can often help us, right, alleviate some of those deficit orientations. So I like what you're saying, right? Like, about how it does that reframing work. I know one of the things that got brought up in the chat was, so I'm doing this, and I'm, because there is a feeling out there that I think we need to talk about, which is particularly around minimum grading. If I'm giving a student a 50 and 100-point scale for work that they didn't do, I'm
Mm-hmm.
giving them something for nothing. I'm
Mm-hmm.
I'm not holding them accountable. And this isn't going to translate into the real world, essentially. I'm coddling them along. Um, so if somebody brought that concern to you, what might you say to them?
Well, I think it becomes it's a math problem, really, right? I mean, when you average a zero, 1 0 could put you in the hole, even if you were to turn in the rest of your work. Like you could never get out of that hole, or there was never an opportunity to get out of that hole. I don't think it puts kids in the sense of, um, well, I'm getting something for nothing. I think it reframes the idea of fairness and what is fair in grading. I mean, if we think back to its historical roots, it was to sort and rank kids. And we're still doing those things. I mean, this goes back to like late 1700s, and it started at Yale. So the idea was really to sort people out into different tracks. And essentially, we've still carried that practice over. So in my mind, and the research, it reframes this idea of like fairness and equity. I don't think kids are going to think, well, if I don't show up to work, like I'm still going to get half my paycheck. I think that is completely different. Even though a lot of people like to equate, well, their job is school. Do you know what I mean?
I, I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think that's a little bit of a problematic mentality, right?
Yeah.
Because as uh, as adults with jobs, or even like teenagers with jobs, right? There's mobility there. I'm not legally required to show up to my job, right?
Exactly.
I choose to work here, and if I don't want to work here anymore, like, I can choose to work somewhere else. I don't get that choice in math class, right? Um,
Right.
I have to go to math class.
Compulsory attendance rules and
Yes,
laws.
exactly. So, often school's not really an option. It is it's an obligation.
Mhm.
And so I don't, I think it's equating school and work is really dangerous for lots and lots of reasons, right? But it also, I think it also kind of misstates the power differentials that are at play in these different
Yeah.
spaces also. And I think the other thing I just want to say about that too is, when we talk about what the real world is, if you asked me what the real world is and I asked you what we think the real world is, I think we're going to get different answers. Even though we work together, even though, you know, um, we have similar beliefs, values, and ideologies about lots of things. I think we're going to get different interpretations, right? So I think, we're often imposing our vision of the real world onto kids. And I think it's sometimes overly harsh. Is the yeah, is life hard? Sure. Is are there some draconian places out there? Of course. Um, but I think I don't know, I think we have a really personalized, potentially an overly harsh vision of what the real world is. And I'll also say, and this is a really direct statement, but I think creating a harmful environment and a less responsive and compassionate environment now, because kids might face that later on, is not good pedagogical practice. It's just harm now. And I don't think we need to do that to prepare for harm later, right? I would hope that kids like leave school with an ability to like ask questions and critique systems like this to say, you know what, I actually deserve something different. And if they choose to have kids later down the line, maybe their kids deserve something different too, right? And so I think as teachers, leaders, curriculum directors, we can stand in the way of harm and cycles of harm.
It's making me think about when you said, you know, imposing a really harsh, reality, false reality of what the real world is inside the classroom. I mean, there's also power dynamics at play too, right? And positionality. Like you are, as a teacher, you are in the position of authority and you get to determine what the grade is. And that feels very different, when students are actually getting to determine their own grades or what they think that they deserved or have earned. I think, sticking with a 0 to 100 or an A to F, it's very antiquated. I mean, and it continues to perpetuate practices of tracking and ranking and sorting kids. But it also can lead into, and I know we didn't talk about it here, but it can also lead into areas where students are misrepresented because of their grade, because of
Mm,
the person in power within the classroom. So I see a lot of kids that are, put into an intervention course
true.
because of a grade, and they really don't actually need the intervention. So even that, like we talked about it in our blitz, like this idea of deservedness and what kids actually deserve versus what they earn and can show you what they know. I mean, it's very different, very different. So I think here we have an opportunity to create some better practices and systems so that we can prepare kids to engage in like critical conversations or reflective thinking or even self-assessment later on in life.
And this is I love that. I love that framing of, how kids get into interventions and how deservedness plays into that. I think that's really important. We also know that failing grades are often a source of the school to prison nexus that happens, right? So, I've heard Deborah Appelman talk about this, where, we think about like school to prison nexus as like the gushing Mississippi River, right? But really it starts with very small tributaries. And over reliance on intervention, failing grades, suspensions, and like all of this can factor into the larger issues at work. So, um, because particularly the secondary level, failing grades, right, can put you quote unquote off track, right, for graduation. And then once you get off track, it's very hard to get back on track. Um, so I think there are lots of issues there that we need to be concerned about. Um, and again, we're not saying kids don't need to learn things and meet and meet the mark. But we are saying I think that this goes into multiple means of expression, like you said, reflection, critical conversation, um, and really thinking about, I think, how to make, and this is a bigger topic, but how to make school, I think, more accessible, more universally design oriented for kids. Grades really, I think, do stand in the way of that. They're a barrier for sure. Particularly the way that they often work with attendance requirements that people put in there, and draconian tardy rules. 3 tardies, you lose 5%, which we've seen. I just wouldn't do that for all these reasons. I mean, I think that's another conversation too about again, universal design, ableism. Who are we rewarding with our grading structures? Who are we privileged? It does. I would say, to your point too, the A to F, the 0 to 100 grading structure really does privilege a certain kind of student
Most
to your
certainly.
ranking and sorting.
Yep. That was its point. That was its intention. And because
And
there,
it's living into it. It's
I
doing what
mean,
it does.
hundreds of years later, we're still in this, um, many schools still are in these practices, right? And it's because there are so many other reforms in schools that they want to tackle first. So
Mhm.
grading is always pushed to the side. Grading and assessment are always, we'll get to it, but it really is something that should be at the forefront because it could impact your attendance. So if you think about why kids might not be coming to school, it might be other reasons that are happening inside of the school.
I mean, that's a really good point when we talk about chronic absenteeism,
Yeah.
right? Again, particularly maybe at the secondary level. But kids feel assessment pressure even at younger ages.
They do.
Um, so this, I think this is this is really important. And folks that are out there that are listening to us, if you see assessment and grading sessions, please come to them, because what Heather just said, I think, is really important, which is that these systems are barriers to getting kids through the door, and keeping them in school and being sure that they have a good experience there. I think that a lot of people maybe don't come because they don't feel like they have a lot of agency in these areas, right? But I think, as we talked about the Blitz, I think teachers have a lot of agency in the input side of the grading structure. And also, leaders, I think, have a lot more agency than they realize to push more systemic change. Um, sure, I understand that, we have to give the MME suite, right, right? It's happening. Um, so we're not talking about that. I'm thinking about that box activity that we did a while ago with some folks, and that fills up the whole box. But how do you make it so other things can fit in that box too? And so removing some of these barriers that we're talking about allows more things to fit in the grading and assessment conversation.
Messaging matters.
Sure, for sure. We'll talk about that in a second too, but that's a good point. All right, let's talk about this question, because this is a hot topic. We were talking about an article that you shared recently, right? That uh had some really good points about what we were just talking about, but then came back to this idea of grade inflation again. So what do you think, or how do you feel about grade inflation, and do the strategies that we're talking about contribute?
You know, I would say yes.
Mhm.
Yes, the strategies that we're talking about contribute to it. Um, they can also contribute to grade deflation too, I think. Especially when we're talking around like zeros for missing
Hmm.
assignments or things like that. But I think teachers feel this enormous pressure to and I think it may come from like kids, and it could come from themselves, it could come from the messages that they hear in their within their system, but also families, that they want, like, all kids should have A's, right? Or they feel the pressure to give a student A because maybe they worked really hard. So we're kind of conflating effort that is put into it with what we actually like see as evidence of learning. And so um, I think, I mean, there's a lot of things that go into the grade inflation. I see it most often at the secondary when there's like pressure from parents, like, oh, this parent's really tough, or I'm going to get an email from this parent wondering why, or I have to be able to explain it. And so it's just easier to give, an A, right? But is the A truly representative of all of the content that you taught that the student has, can say that they are proficient on? Probably not. So I think that there's pressure, and I think this you mentioned that, agency, like how we input our grades, how we talk to our students about our grades using feedback, how do we get kids to like get themselves involved in the learning? I think that those pieces could help with that grade inflation.
Yeah, I think what you said is true, right? A lot of the traditional practices, I think, are actually maybe also responsible for grade inflation, right? Or
Yeah.
maybe even mostly responsible. Like, um, we saw it in the chat during the Blitz, like there were jokes about like the extra credit for the Kleenex boxes or the Clorox wipes, right?
Yes.
That is a great.
Yes.
We talked about curving in the Blitz, right?
We
So
did.
they're like you're in a chemistry class and people, the top person gets a 70 on the test, and then you just say, well, we're just going to bounce everybody up 30, right? And this leads to, I think, very inaccurate pictures of what a person knows and can do and where they need to work and where they need to grow and what they're already strong in. It's not a full picture, an accurate picture. And so I think actually a lot of these traditional practices factor in. Certainly, again, this idea of deservedness comes up. Do I
Yes.
like, do I like you? Do you try, right? I mean, I think if you're really interested in thinking about maybe working out grade inflation, and we'll talk about whether this is a helpful frame in the first place, but and I guess in a second, but you know, if you I think experimenting, if you're truly interested, I think experimenting with labor-based grading, um this is a space where it can certainly help, because there isn't that inflationary pressure, and it is a more, I think, liberatory way to get out of because great inflation for me comes with scarcity, right? The whole reason that we're thinking about inflation is because we think that too many people getting A's is suspicious. And if you get an A and I get an A, your A is diminished somehow, or my A is diminished somehow, right? So we got to get out of that scarcity mindset. I found personally labor-based grading helps me, helps students be more in abundance and not worry so much about that, because it's about your um it's about the labor that you do. I know that Asao Inoue talks about this. David Buck has a labor reflex model that's really good. I think everybody kind of has their own twist on it, but um, I guess let's just go back to that do you think that like do you think that grade inflation is a helpful frame? Do you think we should even be like, should we even be platforming this as
Well,
as a
I think,
consideration?
but I think it happens. So one of the things as you were talking about, um, scarcity and like the diminishing of A's, and when you have too many A's in a classroom. I think we also see it too pop up when and not that there's like a direct correlation, but there's a connection between the content you're teaching and the content that is being tested on a state summative assessment. And so
Mhm.
when you don't do well on a state summative assessment, and it's and the standards are the same in the class and on the test, it causes some questioning around, well, the student got an A, but they were not proficient. Now, I'm not saying that's the end all be all, because, state summative assessments are a snapshot. It's a 1 day picture of a student. But hopefully, we get that comes up a lot, especially when I'm working with secondary spaces with grade reform, or even with designing their MTSS framework, is that there is a disconnect between like grading practices and like overinflating of grades and what kids can actually really do versus like how they actually really do on something as important as like a state summative. That comes up all the time. And, you know, would we want them to be similar? Maybe, you know, I could make arguments either way, but if we're giving a child an A because it's easier not to deal with the parent, that's problematic.
Yeah. So I think two things here that are important about this question, right? Yeah, I think what I kind of am hearing you lean into a little bit is perhaps a little bit also of this idea of saviorism, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, yeah.
and I think when we're thinking about reforming grades, it can't be about that. When we're thinking about rethinking grading, it can't be about saviorism. And the way I'm gonna I'll frame it the way Alex Chevron Vinet frames it, which is um, good intentions mixed with low expectations,
Yes.
right? Um, and actually in her book, which is a really brilliant book, she talks a little bit about an experience that she had that I think would ring true for lots and lots of people, including probably both of us at one point or another. Where she was teaching a class and she had a multilingual student. And she really did not give the multilingual student the feedback that she gave the other kids. Not that feedback should be differentiated. I don't think she'd argue that, but I think she's saying this student deserved a little bit of honesty in terms of, what I see here. And by me just going, hey, good job, that's not helpful to that kid either, right? So when we're talking about these reforms, we're talking about compassion, we're talking about equity, but we are not talking about, I think, saviorism or dishonesty, right? Or not being forthright with students and having that really good culture of feedback that you need. And the other thing I'll say is about the frame of grade inflation is I would not be I mean, I'm maybe not suspicious if lots and lots of kids are getting A's. And I would think the reason for that would be that if truly we believe that we are growth oriented professionals who are getting better at teaching, our
Yeah.
pedagogies are getting more equitable and compassionate, we should by by virtue of that be seeing higher grades, right? If your and my pedagogy is getting better,
I would agree.
shouldn't at the end we see more A's, right? Now,
And
how does that show up in other spaces? I think that's an interesting other question, right, to deal with here. But like, if we're truly being more responsive, more A's should happen, right?
more A's should happen, but I think, and I'm thinking like at the end, in the spring, because that's
Hmm.
when, I mean, that's how schools are, measured. It's how districts are measured, and it's important to leaders, principals, leaders, and teachers. But I think if our pedagogy changes and gets better, we're going to see that show up.
If we think about middle schools and high schools just for a second, right? I think if you're teaching alongside the disciplinary literacy essentials, for instance, right? and you've really, you're working through them, these are guiding your practice.
Yep.
That will show up, I think, both in the grades and at the end, right?
Yes.
Because lots of things are tied to disciplinary literacy practices. So, if we're talking about state summative assessments, those are tests of disciplinary literacy. So if you're teaching in that way, it should show up both locally and at that like larger summative level. All right. This is a question that I don't know, we got this in the chat, but we've gotten this before. We've heard this. How do you navigate, and I've heard you talk about this, how do you navigate caregiver conversations around alternative grading strategies? So like lots of schools out there, standards-based grading, and then they have to do report cards.
Mhm.
And then the parent goes, Heather's got a 3. I don't know what that means. How- what do you suggest to those people in that situation?
I think there's a lot of different like areas where clarity can be brought to families and opportunities to bring clarity to families. So if you are working in your classroom to make some small shifts, um, communicating that with families during an open house, a curriculum night, your syllabus, but also communicating it to students as well and making sure that they understand how they will be graded and keeping it consistent for a duration of time. So if you're going to try it for a semester, keep it consistent for a semester. I found that that was really beneficial when I moved towards, we were working towards a standard-based grading system when I was teaching middle school ELA and mathematics. And just being honest as to what I was going to use. I was very transparent. It was very clear. The scales that we used of 4-3-2-1 were outlined. Kids understood what they meant. We actually had a 0 in our scale, and the
Hmm,
0 just meant that
interesting.
there was no evidence.
Hmm.
It didn't calculate into their final mark that I had to give, because I had to give a final mark. I was teaching middle school. We didn't have a standards-based report card because I was the only teacher that had moved toward this outside of my teaching partners. So it was a lot of just, it was clarity and transparency and communication with students so that they knew. I would say that kids will pick up on it rather quickly because they enjoyed it. They knew that they were going to get retakes. They knew that they were going to have lots of opportunities to show me what they know over the course of, the quarter or the semester, in varied ways, so that and they were going to be able to tell me what they think they deserved, and I could tell them, or what they earned, and then I would tell them what I thought that they earned as it pertains to our learning our learning goals. Families are very used to our typical A to F, 0 to 100, because they went through school many years ago and often didn't have like a standards base, a labor base, a grade list type of system. So they want a grade. And sometimes that can be cultural too, and understanding that does exist. When I met with families, I was just very clear as to how I will be grading. This is how I will be doing it. I'm not sure what the other teachers are doing, but this is what they could expect to see in the grade book. Like I explained, like when you logged into Power School, you're going to see like there's assignments, but it's really for me to kind of track and monitor where kids are at. They didn't count towards a final grade, like they were checked off of including in the final calculation. It was just my digital way to monitor and track. I had a few families that had questions, but actually the questions weren't necessarily for me. They were for my teaching partners. Like, why aren't you doing what Mrs. Rottermond is doing? So it didn't take long. I would say maybe the first card marking or the first marking period, I got the most questions. But we had conferences right after. So I was able to explain, what I was doing and why I was doing it and what I saw in the classroom and how it changed how kids were,
Mhm.
they were less they felt less about they were less worried about like the points that they would get or whether or not it would be graded. It was more, they were more focused on what they had to do to improve their learning. So that's an argument that I always get, like, well, they're not, if it's not graded, it's not going to count. They're not going to do it. That's not the case. They did it. They knew it was important. They knew they had to do it because I was going to eventually ask them to show what they know on something kind of big.
Yeah, I mean, I I think we've all heard about like, mastery oriented grading systems, which is like 80% summative, 20% formative, right? And I know we talked about this a little in the Blitz session, but it's also like a lot of times that 80, like, and I know that summative formative has problems as a dichotomy anyway, but like this, I so a lot of people just go, yeah, this is mastery because I need you to do it. So, right, I'm going to factor it into this 80% because uh rather than maybe thinking a little bit more intentionally about, how things fit together or lead up or interact,
Right.
as they're all part of a process, right? So I
Right.
think, this has, and this is what I always say about grading, it has tentacles, right? So you can't just change grading and then never change pedagogy because it won't work. And if you change your pedagogy, you're probably going to want to change your grading eventually. Um, but this also speaks to moving away from like activity-based teaching
Yeah.
into maybe something into planning maybe differently, potentially.
Everything was very purposeful. Everything we did in class had a purpose and it built upon the things we did prior. So if we think about how we learn in those ways. We continue to build on what we've done previously. That's why prior knowledge is really important and tapping
Mm,
into that and making sure that our lessons are connected from one day to the next. So this idea of like activity based learning, when that is disconnected from like where we're actually going, that's when kids like they get lost. So
yeah.
you
Or they're like, what are we,
why
why
are
am
we
I
doing
here?
this?
Yeah, why am I here?
Why am I
Um,
here? Why do I have
other
to
than the
vote?
compulsory stuff that we talked about earlier.
Right.
They take that Marshawn Lynch meme and
Yeah.
they're just here so they don't get fined, right?
Yep.
Um,
That's it.
so we don't want that. I love what you said though, right? Like, I know there was some requests in the chat that we do a hacking the gradebook session,
Yes.
right? So we'll get that in the cards, but like, one thing I heard from you is to do alternative grading, you do have to hack the gradebook.
Yep.
And because LMSs, I don't know.
They're designed, I mean,
That's a
they're
different
designed,
conversation, but it's
but
an
that's,
aligned conversation. But yeah,
yeah.
they're not. I think I think and we I think the LMS, right, pushes us often towards bad pedagogies. Sorry. If that
You
yeah. I mean,
you have to hack it.
you have to hack it. If you're gonna, particularly if you're interested in any of the things that we're talking about here, right? You have to
Yep.
hack it. But
Or you have to find another way to like document what you're doing. And
sure,
then, but
that could be
the,
true.
but you may work in a school where it's required to put something in your, in your LMS or in your grade book. So how do you work around that?
And I want principals, assistant principals, curriculum directors, superintendents, please stop making your teachers
Please don't do that. That's how
say you have
that's
to have 3 grades in the grade. So you get the busy work, right?
busy
Um,
work.
we
And then you,
understand that we got to find better ways to communicate with families about progress, right? I think
yep,
that's but I liked what you said. Even if you hack the grade book, right? Let's say that's happening, which you had to do and I had to do, to get the things done that we wanted to do. You can still be transparent, right? Like, because that is a big thing that I heard you say, right? Like, transparency is really important. Why am I
yep,
doing what am I doing? What is it going to look like? I love what you said about the syllabus too, because often I think we think that the syllabus is a set of like blah 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 procedures, right? What if we rethought the syllabus to be like a different kind of document, right? A document that isn't assertion of values, is a method of transparency, and it's not, you can get 3 bathroom passes per trimester, but rather, right, like, here's what we're setting out to do, here's why we're doing it, here's what you can expect. The thing I know,
Partnership.
yes, the thing I know about you too, though, is and we've talked about this a lot also, is this really requires a strong feedback culture, right?
Yep.
So like you can have standards-based grade, like, and I had, like, I posted something about this a while ago, but if you have standards-based grading and it's just traditional grading with more steps, don't do it. Like,
Don't do it.
you get the strong feedback culture in place that's necessary to do something a little different, right? Because giving me a 3 does not maybe totally help me without feedback, right? Because I don't know how to get to a 4. I don't know why I am at a 3. So just 3 is no better than B, right? So
Exactly.
if you're just having it that way, don't do it. It's more work for teachers.
Yep.
It's more work for families. Just,
It's grading in disguise.
it's
I mean,
grading in disguise,
it's
right?
traditional grading
That's
in
great.
disguise.
Ooh, we're wow. I'm gonna write an article about that.
It's
Well,
coming.
yeah, that's coming. I'm writing. I'm putting that on our to-do list. I like that, grading in disguise, right?
Mhm.
Um. All right. So yeah, transparency, planning, hacking, right? These are all things that we have to do. But
You know, Jeff,
I like this
one
thing
more
about
thing I
transparency.
one more
Yeah.
thing I would add to it. When you talk to caregivers and families and even students about these strategies, I think you really have to center like equity, compassion in those conversations. It doesn't mean that somebody is not getting something because somebody is getting something else, right? Like
Ooh.
you are looking
Mm.
that's a big deal. Like
Yes.
because a lot of
Competition.
competition, people think that that's
Yes.
like kids like that. I think like that would bring me anxiety as a learner, like knowing that I'm competing for the 3 A's that you're only going to give our class. I
Uh,
wouldn't like that. But this idea that everybody in here is a learner and everybody in here is capable is much different. That's a different stance to take. And so
mm,
when you talk to families about that, um, I find that I've not had an issue with it, but I have found that families are really understanding of it. That, because you hear, well, my kid's not a really good test taker. That's okay. That's okay. We're here to learn. We're here to learn. And I'm going to design learning experiences that will allow me to know what your student knows and what they can do, so that they don't have that anxiety to perform.
mm, mm. This is a really great point. I think the competition angle has been so emphasized in schools, right?
Yeah.
It's the ranking and sorting. Kids feel that.
Yep.
Um, you know that I ran a writing program
Yeah.
for almost 12 years, right? And I had a student come to me and and say, um, they were curious, they were about the, why would I join up with your program when I'm helping my competition do better, right? That
Yep.
that was that was a prevailing attitude, right? And the our our writing program, our peer tutoring program stood opposite that kind of idea, right? Um, because what you're talking about is like investing in community. You're talking about um investing in this idea that we're all in it for each other.
Yep.
That's a very different kind of messaging than
Yeah.
traditional grading has given for as you've said, a very, very, very long time.
I would
The
also add too,
Go
Jeff,
ahead.
that like I'm thinking about my undergrad and graduate college experiences. That's how it's been. Like learning, like we want it to be a community of learners. We want people to be collaborative. Like a lot of college courses, that's what they want. That's what they're looking for. And so if we're setting this tone of like competitiveness and I'm in it for me, that's hard to break when you get to college.
Yes. And I would say, I want to also go back to your point about anxiety for just a second.
Mhm.
I do want to say two things. One, when I had conversations about labor-based grading with parents, I was admittedly nervous a little bit about it because you never know how people are going to respond, particularly because of what we were just talking about with how things got set up. But a lot of people will breathe a sigh of relief also to
Yeah.
your point, right? Like now I this comes up sometimes too adjacent to this question, and I think I just want to say this, and then we can go to the last one, which is don't students get anxious when kind of quote unquote the established rules of the game change? And the answer is sometimes, right? There are
Yeah.
students who have gotten very, very good at the game of
Playing school.
deservedness, playing school.
Yeah.
They've gotten good
Yeah.
and they know the rules and they know how to exploit those rules. And I'm not using that in a deficit term because that's what they've been, again, with competition, that's what they've been taught to do, right? It's how the system has developed them. So that's not their fault. Um, so there is a little anxiety until in a community oriented learning space like the one where it's different, right? So there is some anxiety in that period of dissonance and change. I would say that the stronger we are in our values and beliefs and the compassion that we have, we can get them through it and to the other, to a different future and imagining different things, right? I actually think once students experience um an environment that is community oriented, that doesn't rely on competition that grades provide, that doesn't situate itself at the center of ranking and sorting, I actually think that they feel that it's irresistible. It's much better. It's a different way is possible. We don't have to compete. We don't have to, you know, not everything is about scarcity, but we can live in abundance.
Great. Great.
All right. So we've gave ourselves some tasks in that little part, right? About we'll do a hacking the grade book thing, we'll write some stuff.
Yeah.
All right. And then finally,
All right. So this last question, Jeff, is a good one. Like, this sounds like more work. How do we create a more feedback rich environment without spending even more time at work? We know teachers are working a lot.
they are.
It's
I
a
mean
hard
it,
job.
it's sadly not getting any easier.
No.
Um, there's lots of reasons for that, but what do you think? Is there a way to do this without saying
Yeah.
I'm gonna work 80, 90, 100 hour weeks?
So there's a couple different things that are coming to my mind, like creating that class community where there is trust. You can leverage, like students can leverage one another to help with feedback. So it doesn't feel like the teacher has to give, you know, all 25 students times the 5 periods they're teaching the same amount of feedback. The other thing too, I think feedback becomes really overwhelming, especially at the secondary space because of, the shifting class periods, but kids don't all need the same amount at the same time.
Mm,
So, are there ways that we can give feedback that is just enough for them to, make sense of it, receive it, and then use it on their work?
mm,
That's the other key piece, right? They have to have an opportunity to do something with it. A grade is not feedback or a score. Um, so, I think you have to really know your students, and that means that you've set up a responsive learning environment. So it means that you are engaging in formative practices. You're constantly looking at student work. You're talking to kids. You're listening to what they're saying. You've designed these learning experiences that are relevant. That's going to give you the information that you need to give that feedback to students. Um, One of the things that I will say that I did as an ELA teacher, I would only look for like one piece, and that would be the feedback that I would give. So if we were doing a writing sample or a writing piece on argument writing, I might look specifically just at the evidence. And that would be all I would give feedback on. Like, I'm only looking for the evidence that you're using. Are they coming from credible sources? Are you just pulling in evidence from your head? Right. So that would be the only thing that I would look at. And then I would give feedback, or I would look for patterns within those samples of writing so that I could either do some global feedback to the entire class, maybe through some reteaching, or I might even pull small groups if they needed something separate. So feedback can come, I think, in a variety of ways. It doesn't always have to be you writing through the paper and marking it all up. You can,
This
I
is
think,
so this is so good, right? Because I think we need to get the days of sitting at a table with
yes,
150 papers at midnight writing in the that those days have got to be over. It just doesn't it and there's studies out there that we could go through, right? This doesn't
Butler.
there's right, there's no and these are decades and decades worth of research, right?
Yep.
There is just nothing that there's nobody that's helping. It's making you frustrated. It's the student is not using it
Yep.
probably.
Yep.
As research shows, that's not a Jeff Austin, Heather Rottermond opinion. That's in the literature about it.
Yep.
Although we could probably speak anecdotally about times where we've seen that happen, right?
Oh
You've
yeah.
written everything and the kid puts it in the recycle bin on the way out the door, right? That that's been there. Um, so that is not joyful. That's not joyful assessment. That's not joyful feedback. There is, you know, there's nothing exciting there, right? Plus, I also think we need to mention if you're doing that, right? And I love what you said about talking to kids. If you're just grading at your table at midnight, the most important voice in the room, the writer, is not there. So you are reading in absence of the writer. And sure, that happens a lot of times, right? We often read in absence of the writer, but um, you have access to the writer. um, and so talking to them about the choices that they made and why things happen the way that they happen were, I think, are really important things and can make it more joyful. I would advocate for assessment environments that, and this, I know we try to try to separate assessment and grading. However, I think there are points at which these conversations come back together, obviously, because they've become inextricable in lots of ways from one another. But like creating, and you talked about this, creating more responsive environments. I would say that creating environments that are intentionally, equitably hospitable are really important. So you have an understanding. This is the hard work of teaching, the beautiful work of teaching. You have an understanding of the needs of each student a little bit, right? You
Mhm.
know because you've done some formative work, right? You have an understanding of what each student needs, and I love what you said too. Not in the same dosage, maybe not at the same time, maybe not in the same way, but they understand. You have an understanding, right? And
There's
what they're
a
facing, what they're bringing.
there's a really Jeff and I, with our colleague Laura Gabrion, wrote an article all about humanizing feedback practices, and it's available if you just search humanizing feedback practices. You'll be able to quickly find it. But what we talk about is this idea of building a relationship with a student in order to give the feedback and for that feedback to be received. And so, really focusing on getting to know students, leveraging the funds of knowledge that they bring as a way to enhance the learning and support the feedback practices is really what it's all about. And research, has found that kids are not going to be they're not going to receive that feedback or use that feedback, one, if it's combined with a grade or score, but two, if they perceive the adult in the room
Yeah.
as somebody that doesn't care, that doesn't trust, you know, doesn't
Just another
perceive,
person with an opinion,
just
right?
another person with an opinion. Yep.
So the other thing that I want to go back to what you talked about too, and this relates to what you just said. Um, I think this is a good opportunity if you are using rubrics to rethink your rubrics. We have talked about the problem with rubrics extensively. Alfie Kohn has too, but right, where you can get to the very, very fine gradations. So you can, and often a lot of those boxes that go, they can be tough to like, what's the difference between, um, somewhat and very,
Yep.
right? What's the difference between, um, excellent and very good, right? Like, so we get into these splitting hairs. And so I actually thought when single point rubrics, I think can help, to
Yep.
your point, ease your job, because then you're not looking for everything. You're not looking for everything in every piece of writing a student does,
Right.
or everything, every, y- you don't have to comment on every line.
One of the
Um,
things that I found really beneficial with the single point rubric was the very last piece that I talked to kids about was like their spelling and grammar.
mhm,
We're going to come back at the end and fix that. That's not the most important thing right now, unless like it was like I couldn't make sense of it.
right.
But I was focusing on other pieces, right? I think sometimes with the rubric, when we have like the conventions and the grammar in there, like that's where we go quickly because it's very easy to
And
give
well,
feedback on.
Well, and to that point, right, we don't want rubrics to turn into checklists either, right? Of like,
Exactly.
did you put your name in the upper right hand? Uh, you know, did you, right?
Did you
Like,
use a blue or
did
black pen to
right,
write
we
this?
like that I know we're kind of being it happens a lot though, right?
Yeah,
These are compliancy things that you see. But again, that goes back into making the grade on the piece messy, right? It's very noisy. If you have that. And one of the other things that I think, just to lift here, we're kind of speaking from an ELA, social studies, humanities perspective here. Um, but I know one thing that we talked about for our STEM colleagues who may be more reliant on other kinds of assessment. I know one of the things that we talked about during the Blitz session is it is aligning your tests in such a way that, if you're giving tests, aligning them in such a way that you can easily identify what a student is missing, so they don't have to retake the whole thing and you don't have to rewrite the whole thing, right? So, oh, a student missed this part of the standards that I'm covering, they only need to take that part again. They don't need to retake, because like, again, like you'll get math folks who will come to you and say, but Jeff, I I can't write 7 tests. And it's like, yeah, I don't want you to write 7 tests. It's not a good use of your time. Also,
absolutely
if a
not.
kid, also if a kid's on retake number 7, I think there's another conversation to have with the kid. And
Right.
yeah, yeah. So don't make kids redo whole chunks. Just if you think about what they're think, this is where also I will also go back to, this is where the single point rubric can help you, right? does did they get the thing that you are trying to emphasize at that time?
Exactly.
That's what we need to know.
Going back
um
to the point you're making though about the test,
yes,
that might mean some reorganization of tests.
sure,
It might mean that you add, the piece of the standard that they're working on with certain questions. Or maybe you cluster all of that standard together on your test. I mean, depending on your content, I could see it both ways. It might even make you just rethink about like a traditional test to assess knowledge, versus something else that would demonstrate it better.
yes.
This wasn't all about test design, and we can talk about test design in another session, but um, not all not all learning is best represented as a multiple choice test. believe it or not, it's super, super hard to write a DOK for. I actually don't think it's possible to write a DOK for question, but some people think that they have multiple choice question, but some people think it's possible. But not all learning is best assessed in those ways.
So really, I mean, that's a really great point. And again, if you're a leader out there and you've happened across this video and you've spent the last 40 minutes with us, um, in addition to whatever you spent on the Blitz, um, this is a really great use of some time, um, for your departments, right? To reorient themselves around assessment. Like if you're looking, I would say that if you're looking to change practice, again, this goes back to that tentacle conversation. Often changes in assessment will necessitate changes in practice. So this is a great way if you want to talk about all those things. Plus, as you've heard today, we're talking about hearts and minds. But again, give people time. If you're asking them to rethink this and you think this is important, give them time to do it, right? Give them the space to do it. Give them the support they need to do it too. And we're happy to help you. But yeah, I think that's a really powerful way. Can you imagine like a department coming together to rethink assessment and have those conversations about how to best organize it and what's really important? I think that's also a key here. Also, one of the things that happened in 2020 in March is we said, okay, we need to figure out in our courses what's essential, right? We need to figure out, because there's all kinds of things, right? We need to figure out like what really matters and what the heart of things are. And then we got all pushed around about like kids aren't learning. And then so then we threw the kitchen sink back in. And I do think that pulling back, going a little bit deeper, having these kinds of conversations are actually going to be more impactful and give you more bang for your buck than um, just trying to throw everything at something and not really having that depth, but just trying to do everything.
COVID, that's a good point, Jeff. COVID really provided an opportunity for us to do something different. And we did until we were able to safely return. And then we reverted right back to old practice. So if we could come together, like you're saying, like you're suggesting, and really rethink something different and do something different, I think it'd be really powerful for kids. And I think you would see it, like you're saying, the tentacles show up in other ways.
And I know that there was lots to dislike about that period of time and lots of feelings of isolation and lots of feelings of frustration and I don't think we're seeking here to tell you any different, right? I think we all felt those things too. But I also think, to your point, there were pedagogical things that happened that are worth keeping. Um, and like you said, we kind of went back to our old ways. And school in so many ways, I think, has been slower to change than some other institutions in our society. Um, and I think, we could do a whole dissertation on this, but I just think going back to some of the things that were powerful during that time and could be leveraged again, I agree with you, we would see those tentacles, right? Um, really compelling discussions about um meaningful relationships, right? And how to maintain them and putting humanizing pedagogies at the center, figuring out what was essential for kids to know and going deeper into it, um, providing students with meaningful agency. And I know one of the things, I left the classroom in 2022 to come to RISA, and I know one of the things that I saw was that kids had a lot of questions about, again, why they were there, what was going on, what the purpose of this was. And I think being transparent and open and having those conversations with kids rather than avoiding them or saying, don't worry about it, or this is going to benefit you in the future. I think that it's more helpful to have those honest discussions now. So, um, leaning back into some of that It'll be good. All right. Well, Heather, hopefully this was a robust enough response to some of the questions in the chat and some of these questions. You're a genius. I love working with you.
I think you're a genius. And I love
Ah,
working with you. We make a good pair.
there you go. If you have questions about any of this, if you want to talk more with us about how to support your school or your district, or even yourself, you can reach out to us and we'll be happy to talk more. Thank you.
Thank you.